and I'd like to introduce today Dr. Samantha Holek. She is the state veterinarian for the New Mexico Livestock Board. She has been the lead charge in our efforts with this potential issue. And with that, Dr. Holek, I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor.
Oh, thanks, Marcy. And I'm going to turn my camera off here in a minute once I get my slides going. Thanks for having me today. Some of this presentation, some of you may have seen a little bit of it before. I did try to update it with the most current numbers that we have out of Mexico, and added some additional photos and things to help with describing what this thing does. So I'm going to share my screen here. And you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we're going to talk today about New World Screwworm. A lot of you probably have heard a variety of things about this, but I'm going to go over sort of just the basic life cycle and history of this pest. So New World Screwworm is actually a parasitic larvae of the fly, the New World Screwworm fly. The thing that makes it so different is that it does burrow into living flesh of warm-blooded animals. And so it doesn't just stop at the dead, decaying flesh, but it will actually burrow into live, healthy tissue. And it affects primarily livestock. That's what we hear the most about. Most cases reported are livestock. But it can actually affect any warm-blooded species, including people, dogs and cats, a variety of wildlife, even birds. It's typically found in South America and in the Caribbean. The life cycle is pretty straightforward. The female will lay eggs around a wound or an orifice of any live warm-blooded creature. Even wounds as small as a tick bite are enough to attract the female, and she might lay 200 or 300 eggs at a time. And over her lifespan, which can be anywhere from 10 to 30 days, she may lay a total of 3,000 eggs. Those eggs will hatch, usually just in a few hours, but certainly within 24 hours. And then they burrow, the larvae then burrow into the tissue. And after about a week of feeding, the larvae will then drop off and burrow into the soil where they pupate and complete their life cycle. And in as little as a week or as long as almost 2 months later, they will emerge from the soil as an adult fly. So I'm going to show you a few pictures. Some of these are pretty pretty vivid. So I just wanted to caution folks here before we go on. So these are some real life infestations. This is a key deer that was affected almost 10 years ago. That animal is still alive, was not alive much longer after this photo. But some of these infestations can be pretty dramatic. This dog did lose its eye. The larvae did infest into the eye socket and behind the eye itself. But I also wanted to show you that some of these wounds can be pretty minor. So management things such as ear tagging can be enough to attract the larvae. And many of us have seen these smaller, more subtle wounds on horses. Like this is a horse's hind leg, where the wound itself really doesn't look all that dramatic, but the larvae will burrow deeply into that tissue, and a wound like this can progress within a very short period of time. So often within a week to 10 days, animals can develop really severe infestations, and sometimes it can even lead to these animals dying. So this is currently not found in New Mexico or the United States. Obviously, this is what we're concerned about, though. It is a reportable disease or reportable infestation to not only the New Mexico Livestock Board, but also the U.S. Department of Agriculture and New Mexico Department of Health, potentially because it can affect humans. It does have significant economic impacts, not only because of the devastation of the wound itself or the potential for those wounds, but also on interstate commerce. So the ability to move animals within market systems, across state lines, and then ultimately on international trade. I mean, many of you probably are aware that we're not accepting livestock from Mexico right now because of the severity of infestation in their country. If we were to get screwworm here, there are many countries that would shut off trade immediately to the United States. So certainly the most important thing is if you see something, say something. These wounds will progress. They get larger because the maggots themselves are actually creating more and more tissue destruction, and that prevents the wounds from healing without treatment. Infestation is often painful because these larvae are attacking live healthy tissue. And so it is a painful wound. It can develop a secondary infection. And as I said, it can lead to the death of an animal pretty quickly. So we do have some sample collection kits available. It is really important when you collect larvae from these wounds to get larvae from different parts of the wounds. So it is common to have multiple fly species infest a wound because you get the screwworm larvae will increase the damage and size of the wound, and it attracts other flies that we more commonly see. And this is the time of year it's very common for us to see maggot infestation or myiasis for wounds. And there are many different species of flies that might be laying eggs and have larvae in those wounds. Screwworm larvae typically are going to be in the deepest parts of the wounds, but it is a good idea just to get a variety of sizes and collect larvae from different locations. And you just want to put it into a sealable container with 70% alcohol, and you can use isopropyl alcohol that you can buy over the counter. The collection kits do have alcohol in the tubes, so it helps with that. But if you're collecting, if you don't have one of these kits and you're collecting it on your own, just plain isopropyl alcohol is all you need, and just enough to submerge the larvae so that it kills them. Once you get your sample collected, you can double bag it in a Ziploc or a zip top type bag so it seals it. And then with the kits, we do have submission forms, but we do have a QR code that also takes you to a submission form, so you can provide that information. And I know Tom's going to address a little bit later how to find these kits and where to send them. So the strategy that USDA is using has used in the past and is trying to use going forward to eliminate screwworm is sterile insect technique, and then developing and enforcing movement control with animals, because it's really important that we don't spread this around. It's bad enough that the fly itself can move, but we don't want to spread this by allowing animal movement. And then also increasing surveillance. So there's different forms of surveillance that can be done. Outreach, of course, is very important, just getting knowledge out there for people to understand what to look for and how to report it. So the sterile insect technique is really it's a pretty cool process. Screwworm flies, the females only mate once in their lifetime. And so that is a really key part of this whole process. And so the pupae can be irradiated at a certain, well, when they're in that pupate stage, they can be irradiated to make them sterile. So it's a very small amount of irradiation, just enough to render them sterile. And then as they go ahead and develop into mature flies, they can be released. And the sterile males will mate with the wild females and cause her to lay infertile eggs. And over time, then this will decrease the population and help to eradicate the species. And that's probably one of the most important parts of the strategy that was used to eliminate screwworm from the United States back in the 50s and 60s. So this map just gives you a kind of a timeline for when that happened. And so as Marcy said, it took about 10 years or so to eliminate it from the southern half of the United States. We did have some reincursions through the 70s and into the early 80s while the fly was still present in Mexico. But through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, the sterile fly technique and other movement controls and things allowed us to control that population and push the fly population all the way back down to the Darien Gap, there where that little circle is towards the bottom, and then maintain that gap for many years. And the COPEG is the facility in Panama. It is the one and only facility left that okay, I've got some lines showing up on my map. I'm not sure what's going on here. But COPEG is the one and only facility that was left in Panama currently that produces sterile insects for this eradication program. And so it is a little worrisome that that's the only place in the entire world that produces these sterile insects. And there's a movement to try to get more produced, but it is not going to be a fast process. And I'll get back to that on some other slides here in a minute. But where we are right now, in February of 2023, they began to see increased cases in Panama. And within the next 5 months, it progressed from Panama up into Costa Rica. And then throughout the next several months, then the fly made its way back north until it was finally detected in Mexico in November of 2024. And where you can see the red on this map at the southern part of Mexico, this one single red dot is the most recent reported case and the farthest northward reported case in Mexico, and that's what resulted in the latest border closure. That was a calf that was found with with screwworm in northern Veracruz, and the concern is that that was not a result of animal movement. That was a native-born calf, which means the flies have made it that far north. So the first diagnosis in Mexico, as I said, was in November of 2024. As of mid-July, they had reported more than 3,000 cases. Those are not all active cases. Most of those have been treated and are no longer active, but on average, they do see about 300 to 350 active cases per week, and it has affected the seven southernmost states in Mexico. Most of these have been cattle, but they do have a variety of cases reported in horses, pigs, dogs, sheep and goats, some birds, and even humans. The most common site for fly infestation is around the navel or the umbilical cord. That's the #1 site reported. Others are secondary to trauma, such as vampire bat bites, and then management techniques such as dehorning and tagging. As I mentioned, COPEG is the one and only facility producing flies. They are at maximum capacity and have been for quite some time now, producing about 100 to 110 million flies per week. All of those are currently being deployed to Mexico to try to control the northward spread of the fly. Anybody who wants to get into the nitty-gritty of it, they're dropping approximately 3,000 flies per nautical mile, up to 6,000 flies per nautical mile where they have a really dense population of animals or a high number of cases reported. And then USDA is modifying these drop zones as needed as new detections are reported. Seneca is the Mexican equivalent of USDA. They have increased checkpoints and even dogs, the number of dogs that they have at checkpoints to help detect cases. However, the biggest concern is that illegal animal movement continues to happen, and that's the biggest reason that this fly was able to progress northward through Central America as much as it did. Illegal animal movement is a major concern. Mexico also continues to import cattle from Central America, and there's concern about how much surveillance is actually going on in Mexico because very little information is being shared. Most of the surveillance seems to be passive. They rely on producers to report cases, and we're not sure that there's any surveillance for wildlife. So USDA is focusing on the top 3 priorities are to improve surveillance for the spread of screwworm, to work on better movement control, and then increase the production and deployment of sterile flies. So as you may have heard, not too long ago, Secretary Rollins broke ground on the Moore Air Base in Texas, and that will become a dispersal center. And so what will happen is that pupae, once they're irradiated, they'll actually be flown in that early stage all the way up to Texas, where they'll complete their life cycle and then be distributed from Texas southward. And that will help to improve the survivability of the pupae that are being distributed. USDA also did dedicate about 21 million to renovate a fruit fly facility in Matapa, Mexico, and I understand that they finally have broken ground on that renovation. So hopefully within the next year, they'll actually have a second production facility up and going. It's estimated to produce probably about 60 million flies, so just roughly a little over half the capacity of what the Copeg facility is producing now. They are also considering locations for domestic production facilities, but these will still be a ways out. Once they've identified those, it'll take a couple of years to complete those facilities and have them in full production. And just to give you an idea, we're operating probably roughly at about 20% of the flies that were produced to eradicate screwworm from the United States in the 50s and 60s. So we have got a long ways to go to produce the flies needed. There are some alternative technologies being explored. So one thing to keep in mind when we talk about 100 million flies being produced, these are males and females. And it's only the males that are able to interrupt the life cycle. So the sterile females don't do anything. They get released, but they don't do anything to inhibit the life cycle of the wild flies. So if you figure roughly half of that population is going to be male, if there's any way that we can sort these things before we put them through the irradiation process, we can almost double our capacity just by selectively breeding for the male flies. And then obviously the concerns are many, political climate, financial constraints, personnel, both state and federal, all of those things continue to weigh heavily on us as we try to make our plans and move forward. The lack of timely and transparent communication from Mexico has been very concerning. In education, I think we're making a pretty good dent in educating folks about screwworm and how to detect it and prevent it. Hopefully webinars like this one today are helping to get the word out. Obviously there's resistance to limit trade. We do depend heavily on feeder cattle coming out of Mexico, but we don't want to sacrifice our domestic population for those cattle. We do have the largest terrestrial port in the United States at Santa Teresa. Of course, that is primarily Chihuahuan cattle that come through there, although we do have some Sonoran cattle as well. But there's a lot of cattle that move into Chihuahua and then through that port typically. And so we do have to be careful about how cattle are moved within Mexico and how they make their way up to that port at Santa Teresa. biggest concern ultimately is that we probably are not as prepared as we would like to be. We're certainly susceptible. We've got several months of warm weather ahead of us that are going to leave us vulnerable. So I think that covers, yep, that's all I had for my part. So I saw that there were some questions in the chat, so.
Any questions for Dr. Holick? We will stick around towards the end as well, sort of as a panel opportunity for you all to ask should something come up into the next presentation. So Russell, I'll go ahead and let you go ahead. Just unmute.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Fighting technology. I just had a question there. What is the dormancy on the screwworm? Like, how long can it be dormant?
So when it goes into the soil in that pupa stage, is that what you're referring to?
Well, like you mentioned that we got a few months of warm weather, but then we enter winter when most insects die. But how long can that screwworm remain dormant in the soil?
That's a really great question that I'm probably going to leave for Dr. Smythe to answer. He probably has much better knowledge about that. I know as part of the life cycle, when they are completing that stage, when they pupate in the soil, it can be up to almost 60 days, but that's typically in the more humid climates. So in our drier, warmer climates, they complete that life cycle a little more quickly. So they might actually complete it in about a week.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Okay, we had a question in the chat, and I was gonna have Tom Dean with the Southwest Border Food Protection and Emergency Preparedness Center address the logistics of sample submission. They're sort of coordinating that effort, I believe. So Tom, go ahead.
Thank you, Marcy. Dr. Hollick mentioned submitting samples. The sample kits, we do have those available at any of the extension offices across the state. If you need a sample kit, you can collect them there. The samples themselves will be turned back into the New Mexico Department of Ag, to the entomology department. So if you're doing the samples yourself, you're collecting, you just need it in a bottle with isopropyl alcohol, 70% or above, to keep it intact. But then that gets submitted to the NMDA entomology department with Brad Lewis and Tiffany. And those guys are doing all of the initial ID. If something comes back, it'll go on for further DNA analysis and other things. I do believe after that for confirmation, but we do have an electronic system with those kits so that the application, you can do it right on the phone, put in the location, all of your information, and it can be mailed. And that gives the entomologist time to prepare for those samples coming in. And then you will get a response right back out via email on determination of that insect. So the system actually worked pretty slick, the last one that was submitted. So hopefully for all you guys, it works really good. Marcy? So Marcy, you're muted, but I do see that how many larvae make a good sample. I think you can collect as many as you want to there and submit, but preferably more than just one larvae, but it's kind of what you got in regards to the sample. Okay, Marcy, back to you.
Okay, thanks. So I posted it earlier, but evidently not everybody can see it. So I'm going to repost some resource links for you. And on one of them, there's a QR code, or actually a actual link to that survey that Tom's referring to. for submission. The other question was, how long roughly is the turnaround of submission to result? Anybody know that?
So unless the samples come in with so many numbers that it's hard for the entomologist to keep up. As of right now, Tiffany's been really quick about getting things turned around. So I know the sample that was submitted the other day, it was within a day, we got notification back.
Okay.
But allowing for mail time and all of that stuff. So once they receive it.
And then we'll address one more question before we move on, unless we already covered it. How long do the larvae stay viable in an infected animal? I believe that's what Jim is asking.
Yeah, so they can be viable for up to a week. I mean, you'll see an infestation lasts easily 10 to 14 days, if not longer. So, I mean, you're going to constantly have some turnover as more eggs are laid and more larvae are developing, but they usually will feed on an animal for about a week before they drop off to try to finish their life cycle.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next topic. And in our country, defense is gonna be just as helpful as surveillance. And so we're gonna bring on Dr. John Wenzel. He's our extension veterinarian. And he is gonna be discussing deworming and proper management of that. More is not necessarily better in this case, but accurate and proper management is the way to go. So with that, John, I'm going to allow you to share your screen. Okay, let's see. We're seeing Sammy still. So Sammy, if you or Dr. Hollick, if you could unshare or yeah, stop share, then I think he could get on.
Okay, I thought I did turn it off, but
Oh, here, let me-
I added my slides onto the Sammys that I had before because I was over in Lubbock last week, but
oh, okay.
I don't know if this is.
Yep. Here. So if you scroll down, John, you should be able to.
I'm at the right one. There it goes. Now it's finally starting to work. Okay.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah. So just a few things. What I wanted to talk a little bit is about treatment and medications and all this other kind of stuff because there's a lot of information out there and some of it is concerning and some of it is pretty accurate, and so we need to be aware of what is the best practices to treat with. And one of the things in sample collection, I know Suzanne, or I think it was you that asked the question about how many. Obviously, it's important to get them from different areas of the wounds, but also get different sizes so that we have flies that or maggots that are older and maggots that are younger in that sample. So try to include some small ones and some big ones. But the other thing is that in the event of, if it is a screwworm case, you want to make sure that when you start to treat, so some basics of treatments is you got to get rid of all the maggots in the wound. It's really important. And they burrow in there, so it's almost like a Swiss cheese at the bottom of some of those wounds or deep in those wounds. And it's not as easy as it sounds to get them cleaned out. But those larvae that you clean out, you certainly don't want them to hit the ground either and crawl away. So when you go to cleaning out wounds, you got to be really careful about scraping them into something that you can use to put the alcohol in there and kill the maggots that are left behind in the event that they are a screwworm. And so because some of those may have fed enough that they're ready to emerge and pupate. And so if they do hit the ground, they may go ahead and progress into the next stage. And so it's really important to make sure how you handle those maggots in a case of treatment. So be really cautious about making sure you don't leave any maggots behind on the ground or anything. So this is I got a couple of slides for pesticides, and this is off of a publication that USDA had on somewhere in researching this stuff. I don't even remember what it's from. It's from the National Pesticide Information Retrieval System. It was hit into the USDA channels in December of 2024. I do have that, Marcy, and I can maybe send you this so that you have it to post with the resources as well. But it just goes through a lot of it. Basically, the thing that you need to know about this is that permethrins are really pretty effective to treat the maggots with. And so there's a lot of talk about, oh, the ivermectins and all this other stuff, and I get all that. But most of those products, the ivermectins and stuff, they're not all that, and I'm hoping that Brandon can clue me in later, but I don't think they're as good as people think about killing maggots. And they're pretty good about other things, of course. But so far as the maggots go, there is a little concern about, are they as effective on the maggots as they need to be? And so it's really important that you use, say, an injection, and we'll talk about the ivermectins here in just a little bit, but that you use that in conjunction with treating the wound. And treating the wound is really going to be the key. You got to get rid of the maggots and you got to kill what's left. And so in my hands, using and treating, regular maggots, I've only seen one case of screwworms, and that was a long time ago. But in most maggot infestations, even some bad ones that have been going on for quite a while, either what I like is the Catron spray. It's made by Elanco. It's down at the bottom of this particular slide. It's a permethrin insecticide spray, and it's very effective at killing maggots pretty quickly. And whenever I had wounds like that were pretty maggot infested, what I would do is I'd spray first and then scrape maggots and spray again and scrape more and until I just couldn't find any more maggots at all. And then, and spray the wound again. They used to make a Kumafos spray. I don't think that's on the market anymore. But Coral, the spray is still very effective in for treating wounds and stuff like that, but also for it does have some properties where we use Coral at Brandon's and such to repel flies for a couple of weeks afterwards anyway. But it's really important to understand that it's really permethrins or the Kumafos that are the most effective against the maggots, and that wound treatment is the key. And you really have got to be very dedicated about treating those wounds. So on this list that I have right there, the ones that I've used is Coral and Catron, and I think that they are both really good products and have been really effective for me to use. There's some others listed on here I'm not familiar with, and so I don't really have an opinion or know how effective they are. And maybe Brandon can or Dr. Smythe can kind of clue us in a little bit more on those when he is up to bat. But I think it's really important to understand that you have to treat the wound, and or you're not going to be successful. But in my opinion, I think what we need to do is treat the wound and use an ivermectin at the same time, which is really helpful. And in looking through on treatments and the ivermectins and stuff, and I know a lot of you have probably heard about, feed companies that are wanting to put feed grade ivermectins into prepared feeds and stuff like that and get it out to help control this. And the scientific position on that, at least at this point, to my knowledge, in talking with quite a few technical services veterinarians from different companies, is that nobody believes that that's a very sound scientific practice right now. Because one is we don't know whether the feed additive would be effective against the larval stages, and whether or not they would even be effective against the fly. And the concern about all that is that, and I know there's a very big push that's being made nationally to get that, try to accelerate approval for using that. But one of the concerns that I have about using ivermectins is that we may create a situation, because feed additives, how do we know that they get the right dose, a therapeutic dose, or a dose that will kill the larvae? We don't even know, because a lot of that research hasn't been done. And then the other thing is that there may be inconsistent consumption which would expose some of our internal parasites to the ivermectins at a level that will not kill them, but may put more pressure on to select for resistance. And so what we may be doing is worsening or decreasing the effectiveness of the ivermectins that we use to treat internal parasites. And so it's a really slippery slope, in my opinion, right now to really push for that until there's more information out there. And ivermectin has been, or the avermectins have been kind of thrown out there as the end all be all, but that's not necessarily true. So in looking, I found there was 2 studies that I found that were done in Brazil. And this was probably one that I thought was really enlightening to me, where it compared, there were 2 studies that they actually caused infestation experimentally. What they would do is they would give them a shot of doramectin, of course, is Dectomax, and then is the other. Ivermectin is the other one that they looked at. I will say this right now, and I think I have it in my slide somewhere else, is you do not want to use generic products. This will be a disaster if we use generic products to and expect them to do the things that we need them to do. Because as we all realize, generic products do not have the same efficacy as a lot of our label drugs do, not because of the molecule, the active ingredient, but because of the other proprietary preparations that are included in the name brand products. And so a name brand product is not the same thing as or generic is not the same thing as a name brand product. And one of the things that we do find is that the generic products, especially from an internal parasite position in treating internal parasites, the efficacy of those drugs against internal parasites, the generic products are in the neighborhood of a 2/3 kill, whereas your name brand products are middle 90% kills. And so my concern is to expose the New World screwworm flies and larvae to doses that are not effective. And I think that using generic products can certainly increase the chances we have for exposing those to a dose that's not as effective as it should be. So in this particular product, what they did is they gave them a shot of Dectomax and they gave them a shot of ivermectin, and they waited 2 hours, and then they made a surgical incision and placed 30 first instar stage larvae in each incision, and then they evaluated them for 7 days. I'm going to try to I'm having difficulty reading my slide because the gallery is there. I don't know how to do it, but get rid of that. But anyway, so what they did in this, and then what they did is watch for, and I think what's important here is to understand that in killing larvae, that there is efficacy in those drugs at the time, and it helps in preventing infestations. But so far as using it as a preventative, I don't know that that's something that's on the table. That's why I think it's important to use a product like that when we treat a wound, but not necessarily just to blanket use it as a preventative, if that makes sense. So the Dectomax or Dormectin was 100% effective in preventing the infestations to occur. Basically, 48 hours later, they were pretty well dying off or died off, whereas in the ivermectin treated group, about 29% of the infestations were occurring still. And the wounds began to heal in about 24 hours, and it was progressing in 100% of the lesions by 48 hours. You can read this slide as well as I can, but I think what the takeaway there is that it appears from this study that the Dormectin or Dectomax is probably a little more effective in using in a treatment regimen, treating an infestation that's occurring. And like I said, because the level of that drops, we don't want to give a cow a dose of Dectomax just in case, or to try to prevent it from happening, because if there's not a wound there, it may be 2 weeks or 3 weeks before they actually get a wound and an infestation occur. And then by then, the effective level of that drug has dropped off. So what matters here is getting a therapeutic dose in. That's why it's effective in really treating the larvae as well, is because it was a therapeutic dose at the right time. And I think that's the real key for treating. So also in this, here's my where I don't use generic ivermectin products. There has been resistance demonstrated, I guess, in what it appears like in the research, that to both ivermectin and dormectin, it's more pronounced in Brazil than it is in other countries. And I think the important part of that is that it depends on where the flies or the infestation that if they ever do make it to the United States, where did they originate? If it is in Brazil, then we may struggle a little more with the avermectins in helping us treat, because it may be that those flies originated from an area where there's more resistance to it. The flies from Colombia and Venezuela is evidently less resistance patterns shown in flies that originate from there, and so it's more likely if flies from Colombia or Venezuela get up here that we may have a little more effectiveness when we use the avermectins. And so when we're talking about feed grade avermectins, and a big question has been about in wildlife, that's the biggest concern from a scientific standpoint that has been expressed not just by me but by technical services people that I've talked to, is that we may spur on internal parasite resistance to those two molecules, and we don't want to do that. The other thing is long range was really talked about quite a little bit in the very beginnings of this, because it has a label for 150 days for internal parasites. But the aprenomectin molecule, from what, and maybe Dr. Smythe, if you know something about this, please speak up too, because what I was told is that the aprenomectin molecule the molecule itself is probably going to be less effective against the larval stages than is the ivermectin molecule or the dormectin molecule. And so the concern is that the long range, which really caused a lot of excitement early on, is probably not going to be as effective as we would like it to be. And so, and then moxidectin, which was Eprinex and some of the others, or Cydectin, I guess is what it was. All of the research that I could find was against old world screwworm, which is a different species. I did not find any research where they looked at new world screwworm and its efficacy of moxidectin to it. So I don't know about those products, whether or not they would be effective, because it hasn't really been looked at. And maybe Dr. Smythe can shed a little more on that too. But I think the biggest thing is that we know that if we start to see cases and we need to treat them, wound treatment and then the use of either Ivomec or Dectomax needs to be included in that treatment regimen, but only as treatments, not as preventatives. And with that, we've got to make sure that we use either permethrins or Coumaphos to treat the wound, and make sure that we get rid of as many larvae as we can and don't leave those larvae behind. So right now, I think the biggest things that we have to do is educate producers to not jump on bandwagons about things that may be effective. We need to know that they are, because the consequences associated with using something that could actually, moving forward, decrease the effectiveness of some of the drugs that we use in management practices all the time anyway. Anything that's going to make them less effective is going to have some pretty long-term effects that we may not want to live with them. And so I think at this point, we need to look deeper as to what are control measures and preventatives that maybe would show some promise, and I'm hoping that Dr. Smythe can clue us in, because when I was like last week when I was in Lubbock at a ranchers roundtable, the discussion came up about fly tags, and I didn't have a good answer for that. It would make sense to me that maybe flies and fly tags would be helpful. I don't know that they would be harmful, but it's something that we do need to look into and make sure that the science backs us up, that there is something if we start to have cases that we may want to include into our management schemes. So I hope that brings to light a little bit about the treatment and the drugs and some of the things that we need to be cautious about with treatments, and making sure that if we do and people ask questions, make sure that they understand the importance that it must be the name brand products that we use, especially when it comes to the ivermectin class of drugs, that it's not a generic drug that we use. So, any questions?
Okay. Oh. Okay, yeah, John, thank you. We do have a couple in the chat. Before we get to those, could you quickly talk about why we have resistance, what causes resistance to certain anthelmintics?
Yeah, so the thing of it is that resistance, a lot of that occurs just because of, I don't know, you want to call it bad luck. I mean, it's a mutation, and mutations occur naturally. But what we do know is that when we subject, especially when we're talking like internal parasites, to a product that is subtherapeutic, meaning that the blood level is not as effective or not high enough to create a high kill, well, that's going to select those worms that survive that. A lot of them may have a mutation that allows for resistance to a particular compound. And so with all wormers, and it's really true, and in my opinion, I know I've said this before, but in my opinion, I don't like to use generic dewormers as well. I think that we need to make sure that the products that we use to worm cattle with, and horses and other livestock, are the products that have been researched. The name brand products, the ones that actually went through the research program, because we know and have a very good feel for how they work and what levels they will reach, and the absorption is more consistent, and all these other factors that go into it. So the worst thing we can do is keep exposing them to a dose that's subtherapeutic. And if we're using this stuff more frequently, and we're not given an adequate dosage, that is going to put more pressure on parasite resistance. So with all dewormers, that's a concern, and we don't want to overuse them either. And so it's really important that if we're going to be using different deworming compounds, personally, I like to, especially with horses, I like to rotate, not use the same compound uh, time after time. With cattle, I think it's a little less important because the pressure from internal parasitism is probably a little less in our arid conditions than it is in other places. And so I think for the most part, if we use products that have a really high rate of success with killing the parasites, I think we generally will have that year after year. I think it is timely. There are some new products out. Uh, there's a new combination product that's an avermectin with levamisole. It's a compounded dewormer that is really effective if you have a population of internal parasites that has some resistance patterns to some of the avermectins. The levamisole is very effective at killing those. And so periodically, and I talked to the parasitologist, one of the researchers on that program, and visited with him a little bit. In our arid conditions where we have less pressure, I will say that every animal out there has parasites. A lot of times we will do fecals and not find anything. It's because we're not doing the fecals at the right time. And because this country has been grazed for many, many years, uh, and we've had cattle for centuries out there. And so our ground is inundated with parasite larvae. And so every year there's a chance and generally some level of infestation that occurs. So in my opinion, I think that an annual deworming is probably a good idea. I like to do it in the fall, fairly later into the fall if we can. I think that's the most effective time. But make sure that you're using a drug that has a high rate of kill with it. And I think that helps with the resistance stuff.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a couple questions in the chat. Are certain treatments required to be administered by a veterinarian or I'm thinking also maybe a prescription in any of these products?
So like your Catrin spray, Corel, and all that stuff. The Corel is you have to have a pesticide applicator's license, I'm sure, to use Corel. Tom, you might speak up to that if that's correct. I believe if somebody else knows, maybe Dr. Smythe, but I believe that that's the case to get that. It is effective because it's really effective in decreasing FIPO. Has a pretty good kill rate with flies and a preventative effect for a period of time. The Corel spray and stuff, no, it is not. It's an over-the-counter product. Those are permethrins, and most of these are over-the-counter products that you can use. Generally speaking, to treat maggots or maggot infestations, there's really nothing different that a veterinarian would do that you can't do yourself. Most of those products, but I think if I was treating maggots right now, maggot infestations, I'd be pretty quick to use the Catrin spray and really clean them out good and give them a shot of Dectomax just to be safe. I think that's a pretty good program right now. Treat the individuals.
So that's a follow-up of your preference of injectable versus pour-on.
Okay, I'm an injectable person, just because we know that with the pour-ons, there's a little more inconsistent absorption rates, and that depends somewhat on how it's applied and is it applied correctly, and other conditions. Are they wet? Are they dry? Is there mud or dirt on their back? All those other kind of things that can affect the absorption rate. Both products are effective if they're given correctly, but for me, I like injections because I know that I'm getting the right amount, the right dose in the right place 100% of the time. And I think that's important, especially in cases like this. I would probably be very much more likely to use the injectable than a pour-on if I'm treating an individual with an infestation.
And it should be noted too on these dewormers that they all come with withdrawal labels. Be mindful of that, and also species labels to make sure that what you are giving because the screwworm affects all animals, right? So you want to protect your horses clear down to your sheep, goats, all of that. So be mindful of what those products are labeled for in terms of species, and then of course appropriate dosage. But for the meat animal sector, there are withdrawals that you should note as well. Okay, any other questions? We have time for one more maybe.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Smythe because I need to listen.
Okay, all right. Well,
Thank you, Marcy.
Dr.
Thank you all.
Okay, if you could stop share and then we'll have Dr. Smythe go ahead and bring his up. I want to introduce you to Dr. Brandon Smythe. He is with the Center of Animal Health and Food Safety. He is correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, a livestock entomologist. So they in their center here in Las Cruces do a lot of terrific research related to flying insects and infestations. So with that, Brandon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marcy. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Marcy? And is my screen okay? I can't really see what I'm doing. I'm not good at Zoom.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, cool. So Dr. Wenzel put a lot of pressure on me saying my name over and over again, so I hope I don't let you guys down with this talk. I want to preface the start of this talk really by saying I am not an expert in the New World screwworm flies. There's actually very few people out there that are experts in this area, but I do consider myself an expert in flies. And like Marcy stated, I run the Veterinary Entomology Research Laboratory here at New Mexico State University. It's just at the base of A Mountain, just off of outside of the main campus. If you're familiar with the Las Cruces area, and I've had the privilege of devoting the majority of my professional life to the study of flies. So this is kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Because everyone wants me to have the answers for these things, and I often don't. So this is a pretty terrible pest, and it's, you know, obviously very concerning. But as stated previously, this is the first step, really, is just preparation, making sure everyone knows what we're looking for and what are the best practices, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And so usually whenever I give these talks, I have my usual suspects, right? I got the horn fly, I got stable fly, and I got house fly. And those are the flies that we're all pretty familiar with in cattle production, not only in New Mexico, but throughout the United States. And so now, of course, we're going to have the special guest star of the New World screwworm fly. And I'll slip up and say screwworm fly, but there's not a lot of people who can tell the difference if I don't say New World. But there's multiple screwworm fly species actually, so we got to be kind of careful about what's going on out there and what we're seeing. So, but I'm also a big believer in understanding, you know, the history and the biology of the related pests that we're used to, and how that can influence and kind of educate us and bring to the front the challenges associated with the New World screwworm fly. So I won't talk too much about my usual suspects, but I do want to start off talking a little bit about these guys. And so the hornfly itself, you know, just with all these pest species, there's going to be this cyclic life cycle pattern that centers on the host animal. And, you know, all the fly species are pretty much, I mean, I always joke around too. It took my being married to my wife over 10 years before I convinced her that a fly is not just a fly, right? All of these flies have very specific biological and behavioral adaptations that make them very unique and present their own challenges for control. So whenever we look at the horn fly, which is a fly a lot of cattle producers are well aware of, the main thing here is that, you know, they're obligate blood feeding ectoparasites, so they require a blood meal, the adults do. And so it creates this very intimate association with the pest and the adult stage of the fly that's very important. And it provides us a target to utilize some of these control measures. We talked about ear tags, things like that. Porons are really effective against these species of fly. And the other cool thing about, well, I say cool, but the other cool thing about the horn flies is that they'll actually deposit their eggs in the manure of the animal. And, you know, all the flies, even the New World screwworm fly is going to go from egg, larvae to pupae, right? And the larval state has 3 distinct stages that they develop through. But overall, again, it's providing this targeted area that we can implement some of our control measures for. So we see this with like IGRs, insect growth regulators, and various food additives that help control the pests in the manure. When we look at something like stable flies, there's again differences and similarities between these guys. So stable flies on the backs of the animal, but they're not as closely associated as horn flies are. They are obligate blood feeders, but they'll only feed 3 to 4 times a day. And that's going to be something similar to our New World screwworm fly in terms of the adult interactions with the animals. One thing that kind of gets missed is with the screwworm fly is that you're not going to see a lot of these adults, right? You're not going to have these big swarms of flies on your animal whenever you're dealing with a screwworm fly. They're relatively rare in nature and hard to find. And so I kind of relate it to the stable fly, which, you know, sometimes whenever you put ear tags in, you might not be controlling the stable flies just due to this the short amount of time that they're actually associated with that animal and that target site where that toxic insecticide is located. But they do have immature development and decaying organic matter, again, providing us a target, right? We implement things like cultural control to pick up the manure, pick up the spilled feed, and remove that immature breeding site. Another interesting thing about stable flies is it has a much broader host range than horn flies do. And that's getting back similar to our screwworm fly, knowing that it can infect multiple species. And all of these flies tend to prefer cattle, but they all can go out and infect other species as well. So there's alternative sources of infestation and introduction into areas based on these other animals as well. Housefly, I think everyone's pretty familiar with houseflies. Now, the cool thing about houseflies, and similar to our screwworm fly, is that they're not blood feeders, right? But they are associated with animal production. And these guys will feed on nasal and ocular secretions of the animals, and they have issues with pathogen transmission. So they can pick up disease-causing organisms and transmit them from one place to another, or one animal to another, things like that. And they do, similar to stable flies, prefer that decaying organic matter. Again, these are just here to demonstrate this idea of understanding the pest and how we've targeted these guys that are fairly common in our production systems to date. Now, the problem is whenever we get into the New World screwworm fly, right? A little bit interesting, I said, they're relatively rare in nature, the adult flies. So you're not going to see those big swarms of flies, of screwworm flies around your animal. It's just not going to happen. It's relatively rare to see them, and they're hard to find. And once they're gravid, once they have those eggs ready and they're mated and ready to go, they're going to deposit these egg masses on a small wound. I think Dr. Hollick mentioned that it could be as small as a tick bite that they could take advantage of. And they'll lay 200 to 300 eggs per drop-in, and those guys just go to town. I mean, relatively speaking, as awful as this pest is economically, it's an amazing little creature that has really capitalized in its niche of the world. And so, and I will apologize because a lot of this is going to be repetitive from the past two previous talks. So I probably should have done a better job kind of coordinating, seeing what the others have planned on including. But hopefully there's a couple pieces that'll stick out and you guys will enjoy that. There also was that question earlier about dormancy. All of these flies will enter into a state of diapause. That's basically the dormant state during the winter months. And they will essentially just turn themselves off. So they're ectothermic, they respond to environmental cues, and essentially they'll just kind of shut their system down until environmental temperatures are conducive to them being able to do what they do best. So in terms of the longevity of that, overwintering throughout the entire winter months is not a problem for these guys. So if we do get small, outbreaks somewhere right before winter and think, oh goodness, yeah, we're saved. That's not going to be the case, because once those summer months hit, they're all going to come out of the soil and start the process all over again. So yeah, extremely viable creatures in terms of their biology. In general, too, the screwworms, they like these tropical forests, kind of wooded areas. And so they prefer that as adults, right? As adults, that's kind of why they're kind of seclusive and hard to find. And the adults tend to cluster, which makes trapping and surveillance very difficult. I know there was some talk about some of that stuff going on in Mexico. And yeah, I think, monitoring these populations is a lot harder than we give it credit for. We're not going to be able to hang up those housefly bags out on the trees and collect a bunch of screwworm flies, because those bags are actually highly tailored to attract house flies more than anything else. You won't even catch stable flies in those guys. So a lot of these basic traps that we buy and purchase are very species specific, even though they seem very simplistic in nature. The life cycle from egg to adult, again, is about 4 weeks. I know Dr. Hollick went through a lot of this stuff. And yeah, once the eggs are laid, they're going to hatch. And there is a distinct odor. There was another question about how long, how long will they be active in an infested animal? And yeah, that life cycle during the larval stage is only going to last about 7 days. But the problem is once they start feeding, there's going to be these chemical cues that are released that bring all the other gravid females in that area to the open buffet, which is that live tissue. And so even though a single larvae might only last, 7 days or whatever it might be, relatively short-lived, there's going to be multiple generations of these little younger larvae, older larvae, and it's just going to continuously proliferate and eat that animal inside out, right? And we say inside out, and I think Dr. Hollick mentioned this as well, is, it's really important too where that wound occurs, right? Where those eggs get laid. As soon as they hit any of those vital organs, you could see death within these animals within 1 to 2 weeks if it hits the right spot. So it's fairly rapid. They don't need a lot of time to have a really big impact. And then adult dispersal, that was another thing that was discussed earlier. These flies, it ranges between 6 and 12 miles as their capacity, but you have to realize too that they're not going to fly just to fly. I think sometimes whenever we see these areas or these maps, these aerial maps of like the distribution of it moving north, and we think, well, the name implies that they're flying all over the place, but no, it really comes down to that animal transport being key. And so that's one of those things, again, it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's out of our hands, but Mexico and, monitoring those animal transports is really going to be important. And hopefully, unfortunately, the border shutdown is probably going to re-emphasize the importance of controlling that cattle movement. The good news is that we do have a long history. And again, this is going to be repetitive. So my talk might be a little bit faster than I had planned, but I'll point out some key things. They've been associated with the Southwest United States since 1842. And an interesting thing in Texas in 1933, there was a huge drought. And what those producers did was send all their cows into all these different states, Georgia, Florida, and finish those cows out in other states. But what they did was really expand the range of the screwworm at that time. And so in 1936, Nippling and Bushland, these are the two scientists that are largely associated and credited with the sterile insect technique. They started researching these guys and really expanded the biology of these pests dramatically. And, it was during this time as well that we found out that they're not all screwworm flies are screwworm flies. So there's a secondary screwworm fly that is native to the United States. It's here all the time, but the big distinction for that guy is that it's only going to feed on dead tissue, while, the one of concern obviously is going to be feeding on the live tissue. The other thing is that those two species look almost identical for, the majority of the population. It's hard to distinguish between those two. So if there's ever a case where you want to, you think you might have something, but it could be a secondary screwworm fly, just send it in, talk to your vet, figure out, it's always better to be safe than sorry, right? But it wasn't until the 1950s until SIT, the sterile insect technique, was successfully incorporated, and they had conducted these releases on a island outside of Florida. And I say successfully in quotation marks because they had about 80% control. And as we know, 80% control of this pest is just not good enough. And so what they found out really quickly was that there was a reintroduction of the adult flies from the mainland of Florida. And so they knew they had to go somewhere else. They went to Caracal. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. And that was the first time that they got a true eradication. And so shortly after that, they started eradicating in the southeast and then to the southwest. Again, this is a little history lesson. It might not be that dramatic or interesting for you guys, but one of the interesting things was in 1972, there was this Texas outbreak. So before this, in the late 60s, we had 99% control. And I think the biggest takeaway I took from this case in particular was that in 1971, there was only 444 cases. So Dr. Hollick mentioned, the cases in Mexico right now, they're averaging around 350, active cases that are going on. Texas only had 444 in 1971, and then 1972 they had over 90,000 cases. And, you know, the economic impacts of that adjusted for inflation today, I think I saw was about $1.8 billion to the Texas economy just due to that. And of course, it was focused on Texas just because Texas has a lot of cattle, but there was infestations in New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, California. This fly it doesn't take a lot for this fly to take hold. And if we let our guard down, they're going to take advantage of this. Absolutely. But the good thing about that Texas outbreak was it triggered that multinational response where we worked with Mexico and systematically pushed it all down into South America at that tip that Dr. Hollick pointed out earlier. And there has been sporadic outbreaks. There was one in Panama in the early 2000s, and another one in the Florida Keys in 2016. But those are all handled by that COPEG facility and their sterile insect release fairly rapidly and, you know, pretty effectively. And so here's just a close-up of that Darien Gap that was mentioned previously as well. So this is how far back we had pushed the screwworm fly. And, you know, that Darien Gap, so anything that was north of that line was basically considered a threat and, you know, pushed back towards Colombia. And so, yeah, that Darien Gap was really important until, I think I'm going to skip that one. That was just a timeline of, you know, some of the infestations, and it's not up to date. It doesn't have the current infestations going on. But it goes to today. We saw this map earlier as well. So that biological line, you can't even see it on this map, but those pests are way beyond that biological line. And so what USDA is doing now is just kind of shifting that biological line and releasing a lot of these flies within those red areas of southern Mexico right now. And so that will continuously be adjusted as, you know, these cases keep popping up in like Veracruz, like we talked about earlier. And yeah, that biological line is going to be kind of a floating line for a while until we figure out what's going on. So this is the COPEG facility in Panama. And yeah, we talked about this earlier. Like I said, my talk's going to be a little bit short because it's repetitive. But there is, you know, the sterile insect technique is highly successful. Absolutely. It is one of the best cases we've had in veterinary entomology. I remember being a student and hearing about the screwworm eradication programs and thinking, well, I'm not going to have a job when I get done because we solved all the issues. But obviously that's not the case, right? And never say never in science. There's always things that come up. To date, I think the last time I checked, it was about 35,000 cases in total for this most recent outbreak in Central America. And so that's multiple years, multiple regions. And like we said, it's moving north. Yeah, and it was mentioned previously that they have the capacity to do 100,000 flies per week. Only half of those are actually effective, right? The males are the only ones that are going to be working against those native females. And so there is a need for additional facilities that were discussed previously to help with that. What are we left to do with it, right? I think anytime we talk about pest management, it's always about this integrated pest management. It's this approach that is multifaceted, it's strategic, and it's specialized, right? It's specialized based on the biology and the behavior of the pests that we're dealing with. And this is true for any pest, whether it's crop pests, cattle pests, human pests, whatever it is. We always need to use all the tools that are available. So while the sterile insect technique is valuable and highly effective, it's only as effective as the entire approach that we have. And going back to what Dr. Wenzel said about, you know, getting the word out and having these types of webinars and stuff are really crucial in preparation for what might come. And again, I will reiterate the fact that, yes, we do not have the New World Screwworm fly here yet. And I'm not sure that it'll make it, but if it does, the more prepared we are, the better off we're going to be, right? I think identification is probably one of the most important things, and reporting is key, right? So that we can target those efforts. We can move that biological line. Oh, well, I say we, but the USDA folks, our colleagues over there at the COPEG facility, they can have these targeted efforts with the sterile insect technique and work with a big group of us trying to figure out what's going on. If that biological barrier is south of current infestation lines, we're basically just throwing away time and resources and money. So reporting is absolutely key. And yes, it is true that there's going to be a series of events that are triggered once we find these guys, if we do find these guys on the US side, right? But I guarantee it's better than not reporting something and then losing your entire herd the next year, just like that Texas outbreak. So please be aware, just be vigilant. You know, I think that's the biggest thing I can come across right now is just be aware, be communicative, talk to your vet, have a good relationship with your vet, have a good relationship with your neighbors so that they know what's going on. If they're not aware of the issues, make sure that everyone's on standby and keeping an eye out for these little critters. So chemical options, Dr. Wenzel went through quite a bit in terms of that. So there, for as far as I know, and any of the other speakers can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are no preventative chemical options that are available, not on the labels, right? And there's some anecdotal evidence. There's a couple studies out of South America that Dr. Wenzel talked about. But in general, there's no preventative measures or chemicals that are available at the moment. And so that's really, really problematic whenever you think about the life cycle of this pest. And going back to that original slide where I showed you just how they can take advantage of those animals and the egg laying capacity and things like that become really problematic. But there is USDA, and here's the website. I mean, you got to dig a little bit. There's a link in there, but it's the aphisusda.gov website where Dr. Wenzel got his list of products that are available. Again, there's not a lot of products that are labeled for screwworm use directly. And we've got to be aware of that, right? And all of these products, even the sprays that we're talking about, it's going to be really important whenever you're treating those wounds, like Dr. Wenzel said, to remove all of the larvae, to make sure that you clean that thing out. Because as we know, all of the products that we have are super effective until they're not. And once they're not, then we're really in trouble. So if we are dealing not only with an outbreak of screwworm fly, but also resistance to some of our most commonly used products, I mean, if you go down that list, you're going to see permethrin over and over and over again. And permethrin is great, again, until it's not. So be subjective in how you use your products. Make sure you have good communication with your vets. And yes, again, if you do find an infestation or a potential infestation, make sure you're taking samples before you're cleaning them out. Another thing too is, oh, well, I'll get to that. General ectoparasite control is still an issue for us, right? I mean, here we're talking about losing pounds versus losing an animal completely, right? But a lot of these things can lead towards having healthy herds, having healthy animals that could potentially withstand some of these pressures from the screwworm fly. So if you got a tick infestation and there's all these open sores, secondary infections due to the tick feeding, could be a problem and a source of introduction for these flies. So just keep an eye on all the ectoparasites in general. Make sure you're using things. I don't have any specific recommendations. If you have individual instances where you want to talk about products that you think might work or might not work, we can discuss that later. But in general, we need to be aware of those animals and just making sure we're doing the best to give them the healthiest start possible, right? And that goes into what Dr. Wenzel was talking about with the internals as well. Okay, the other thing is be aware of any abnormal or suspicious events, specifically at calving or castrating. You're going to have these wounds, you're going to have these, you know, open sores, things like that, that those flies could really take advantage of. And I think, again, communication, I'm going to say that over and over again. We have got to communicate. We've got to come together as a community of cattle producers to really be on the forefront of this potential infestation. If it gets here, we need to know where it's at, where it's spread, and how to respond to it as fast as we can. Also pay attention to wildlife. We mentioned this a couple times in some of the earlier talks. You know, there's, in my opinion, and you don't quote me on this, but in my opinion, if it gets far enough north in Mexico, we're not going to see it come over in cattle. We're going to see it come over in wildlife first. And I guarantee, because those, you know, especially in that southern border of Texas, there's not going to be any control in that wildlife. And we've dealt with that with various species of ticks for years now, and they just keep bringing them over and over. So pay attention to your wildlife. If you see some weird things going on out there, if you have questions, communicate, talk to people. If there's something, I mean, this picture is pretty obvious what's going on with that guy, but you know, if there's something that just seems out of the ordinary, it's going to be on us to find these guys, and it's going to be on us to be aware of this problem. So yes, be aware. The last thing I'll say is just make sure your chutes are in good working order as well. I think working facilities, there's rarely a time that I've worked cattle that I haven't seen some kind of blood come out of those animals at one point in time, right? There's always loose bars or something that they're getting caught up on. Make sure you know, work them as lightly as you can. I know cattle can be frustrating at times, and sometimes we get a little bit angry and push them through a little bit too quick. But you know, just be aware that, you know, your facilities are in good working order and that you're treating those animals right. And if you see something weird whenever you're working them, doctoring them, whatever it is, just pay attention to it. And, you know, if we are using ear tags and we do have an active outbreak, you probably use some of those sprays that Dr. Winslow talked about just to keep that wound a little bit clear and free from it for a while. Hopefully they'll heal up pretty fast. So in general, so I told you my talk was going to be quick. I jumped through a bunch of stuff that was already covered, but there is a big potential, but it's not here yet. And we're doing the right thing, having these types of webinars, just gaining knowledge, kind of getting the message out to people that matter, that people are going to come across it, right? If we keep waiting for someone else to find the problem, we're never going to find it, right? So be vigilant, be on the lookout, and just be aware. And I'm sure there's going to be more tools to come. I know, you know, there's a lot of talk hoping I'd give some insight into some of the products that are available. And I guarantee some of these larger companies want to take advantage of this situation, and not in a bad way, right? I'm not trying to like say big pharma or something like that, but they want to be part of the solution, right? And part of that solution oftentimes is going to be pushing products that might not be the most effective option that's out there. That list, for instance, there's a lot of, you know, botanical oil things, compounds that are on there that are kind of interesting to me. They're mostly going to drown those larvae more than actually kill them, which you could get the same kind of efficacy just with Dawn dish soap most of the time. So just be aware of what you're buying, be aware of what your, you know, what your plans are. And yeah, there's going to be some emergency use things should it move closer to the border. I'm almost positive of it. I'm talking to some of the industry folks that are putting in for some of that stuff right now with FDA. So, and finally, again, I've said it 16 to 32 times already, communication is key. Don't be shy to communicate. If you see something weird, it's up to us to really get moving on that. So with that, I would like to take any questions. I'm going to try to figure out how to stop sharing. I think it's here. Okay.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Any questions for him or any of our other presenters today? We did have one in the chat on, and this one might be for you, Dr. Hollick, on the game managing agencies being aware, and have they had an opportunity to become educated in this issue?
Yeah, so we have been working with our New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. Dr. Crockett, in particular, has been included in our meetings for surveillance and just planning. We're going to distribute some of the collection kits to her game officers as well, the game officers within our agency. And then we are additionally coordinating with Arizona Department of Agriculture and their game and fish officers. And then we also include the USDA Wildlife Services folks in our conversations. We're really trying to broaden our our net, if you will, of people who are keeping an eye out on what's going on.
Any other questions for our speakers?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, Dr. Smythe, and thank you for your presentation. It was very helpful. And I have two questions for you. One on the dormancy. What stages go dormant? Is it the fly itself, or is it the larvae or the pupae, or what? What tends to go into that dormant stage?
So I'd have to look into this with screwworm fly, but typically, with our horn flies, stable flies, and larvae, our horn fly, stable fly, and house flies, it'll be the late stage larvae or the pupae. So both of those states will have the ability to go dormant. So I would imagine with the screwworm fly, it's going to be the same, but I'm not 100% positive, but it's definitely going to be the immature state. It's not, well, I shouldn't say definitely. Never say never, right? I would have to look into that just a little bit.
Yeah.
But my
Okay.
assumption would be that it would be the immature states.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. The second question I have is that, and I know that there's not been anybody researched it, but do you have a feel for whether fly tags would have any efficacy at even repelling the New World Screwer fly? Is that something that we should even consider in our arsenal?
Well, you know, from a producer's standpoint, right? These flies are going to be present when other flies are going to be present, right? And so my recommendation absolutely would be to use ear tags or porons to control the other populations of flies. Its effect on the larval state of the screwworm fly remains to be seen, but just based on the distribution of the chemical from those tags on the body, on the surface of the animal, I would imagine that there could be the possibility of some kind of secondary control there. Again, nobody's worked on this.
Yep.
The problem with this pest too is that it's been so secluded from the United States that a lot of our colleagues in this field haven't had the opportunity to work on these questions. And when this first came out, I reached out to USDA asking them, would it be possible to get access to the Panama facility to run research? And yeah, that's not an option either, just because they're at max capacity. I think the other thing that I forgot to mention about the Copeg facility is just how big of an effort it is to rear those flies. They have something about 600 full-time employees, and that facility is operational 24/7, and they go through about 100,000 gallons of water a day. And the excess that they create in terms of trash and just waste material is astronomical. So it's not a very easy pursuit to just, I think sometimes it's like, well, why don't we release more flies and do that? It's a big undertaking that those guys are doing right now. And so it kind of bottlenecks our ability to answer some of these questions. But as it moves forward, we're going to need to get more feet on the ground to figure this out.
Well, isn't there sort of a risk factor to bringing research into the US, sort of similar to the island in New York and Manhattan facilities that study disease?
Plum Island.
Plum Island, thank you. They're not able to just research this thing for risk of actually having an accidental release of the fly. Is that correct, Brandon?
Yeah. So USDA will not allow any live animal transport from that Panama facility. Even if they're irradiated and sterile, they will not allow it to come to researchers here. And it doesn't matter the level of security you have in your lab, they're not letting it go anywhere. So yeah, it's a very serious threat. And I mean, rightfully so, it should be. I'd hate to be the NMSU researcher that exposed screwworm fly just because I wanted to ask some questions. But it's one of those things that it makes this pest very tricky and very, very, there's a lot of unknown questions as we brought up in this, all of these talks today.
So one comment in the chat is are there gonna be training videos on how to collect the pupae or the larva? And I know we've discussed that as a group. I'm not sure where or who or how yet, Melissa, but certainly that's something in the works. And then Tracy asked, what are the mechanisms are in place to prevent human to or pet movement across the border? So non-livestock, I guess, and that, I think we're not there yet. Maybe Dr. Holick can speak to that a little more. But that's
Yeah,
one of our biggest challenges.
that is a big challenge. So even with pet movement, ideally they are supposed to have a health certificate within 7 days stating that they've been inspected and they're found free of larvae. Unfortunately, if those animals present to a border crossing without that paperwork, that does not prevent them from entering the country. So they do get inspected by Border Patrol personnel. And if there's no obvious signs of any problems, they're allowed to enter. Again, with humans too. And so part of this additional outreach that we are doing is we actually had a meeting with our Border Patrol and Border Protection folks a month ago, talking about what to look for, because they do see a lot of human traffic that is, people that may not be perfectly healthy. And so they need to be aware of what these things might look like in a human, which is not all that different from how it would look in any other animal. So any other species. And so it is a really important thing just to keep on their radar. If they do see anything of concern, that they refer those people to, where they can get medical treatment, medical evaluation to make sure that they're not bringing it into the country. And I agree with Dr. Smythe. I think wildlife movement is probably our number one risk because there is no regulation of that. And then I think people and pets are the next biggest risks for us.
So he has a follow-up question. It's a good one. You mentioned that and I wasn't aware of this either, that they have dogs that can detect it. Is it detectable in specific species or in all animals or people that might be carrying the larva?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know that the dogs that we utilize at our border crossings are trained for it. The dogs I referred to in my presentation are in Mexico at their checkpoints. But certainly the odor from the wound is something, I think that's what they're keying in on. And dogs are going to be much better at picking that up than humans. And so that is my understanding is how they're utilizing dogs in Mexico.
Okay, so to be a steward of everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today. Just as a reminder that we are recording this, so it will be available for everybody. We'll get the word out. And again, your county agent might be your best first resource for you, but certainly call anybody here that was on the program today as a reference. I've included some links for some additional resources. The idea was not to create a chicken little sky is falling panic at all. The goal again was to make everyone aware how to help yourselves prepare for it and ultimately protect your animals. So I think this is a start, and be again looking for those recordings, and we sure appreciate the feedback and the questions, and be looking for that recording. So with that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's seminar, and hope you all have a good day.
Marcy, I want to make one more comment.
Oh,
I
okay. You bet.
appreciate what you just said because I think that's important. I've been getting a few phone calls, even like at 11:30 on a Saturday night, because they found some maggots in a wound. We got to remember that how far down into Mexico is this, Dr. Hogg? Do you know? Is it 700 miles away?
It's I think only 360 miles from the border now with
From
Texas.
from that northern case, which that northern case in Veracruz, it was what, 160 miles beyond? Is that correct?
I believe you're correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm not terribly concerned about it being right here. I just think we need to be educated and vigilant, but not like, I think that's a great point, Marcy. Right now, we don't need to be yelling that the sky is falling. It's still a ways down there. And so it's something that we should all be vigilant about, but we want to make sure that if we make the call, it's because there is high suspicion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so just be aware and keep your eye out for wounds that look suspicious, but certainly no time to panic. And if, you know, like he said, if it should come to this, where we do have it close to New Mexico, Texas area, Arizona, we'll keep everybody informed. All right, well, you all have a good day and we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Marcy.
Thank you,
all.
Marcy.
You bet.